To be honest, when I first started watching Mob Psycho sometime before season 2 was released, I didn't think it was all that great. I found it interesting enough to keep watching at first, but had to stop at around episode 6 for some time, and then when I could have continued, just kinda put other anime that I still need to watch first, and just never returned to Mob Psycho. Until last year when season 3 started, and I finally thought that now with the end of the story in anime form approaching was the best time to start the anime again, and finally see what it was about Mob Psycho that made it so beloved. And I have to say, that was one of the best decisions I made regarding anime. I don't know if watching more anime from all kinds of genres since the first time I started Mob Psycho 100 changed the way I look at it now, but I already enjoyed the first few episodes of season 1 way more than the first time, and now after finishing all seasons, I think one created a really unique story, despite it having so many similarities to other anime and manga at the surface. One reason I couldn't really get into it the first time I watched the anime was all the things Mob Psycho had in common with other anime that made me feel like I had already seen a lot of it just by watching other stuff, and therefore didn't grab my interest enough to keep returning, and the biggest factor in this was undoubtedly One Punch Man, that I'm sure most know is by the same author one, that I'd just seen prior, and also was the reason for me to even start Mob Psycho in the first place. But I think all the similarities that Mob Psycho and One Punch Man share on the surface, especially with their overpowered protagonist, even when Mob's motivations couldn't be more different to Saitama's, was enough for me to lose interest in Mob and Mob Psycho as a whole. Of course, now after finishing this story, I know how interesting Mob can be and absolutely love him, but I think depending on what point in their anime journey someone is at, Mob Psycho can either seem really interesting right from the start or feel like you've already seen everything and lose your interest like it did with me. I think if I had seen episode 8 before I stopped, then I would have been intrigued enough to continue Mob Psycho the moment I had time again. This time around, even though I already liked the first few episodes more than last time, episode 8 was what really started my love for the series. It not only has what might be the best fight in season 1 and introduces a reoccurring antagonistic faction in Claw, but the thing that impacted me the most in this episode was the relationship and dynamic between Mob and Ritsu, and this relationship between these two brothers was the final push that showed me why I should be interested in Mob Psycho specifically, and why it's way more than those similarities to other anime and manga I picked up on the first time I tried watching it. I think the thing with Mob Psycho is that on the surface it shares a lot of similarities in its story and characters to other anime like a lot of Shounen or of course something like One Punch Man. You have the overpowered MC, his sensei, the villain organization, many stunningly animated fights and all the antagonists that join the main character's side after their defeat. And these are all traits that a lot, and I mean a lot of anime, especially Shounen share, but the thing about Mob Psycho is, and I don't even know if I can describe my thoughts here properly, the way it executes these story aspects and character traits that you've probably already seen similar in multiple other anime just somehow feel new and still really interesting. At least that's how it was for me. I think Mob works as a good example of this. Even though you've probably already seen countless anime with an OP main character, Mob is still probably quite unique among these. He's not like just another one of 100,000 OP isekai main characters that do everything effortlessly, or someone like Alucard, who has no problem with showing others just how strong he is, or even Saitama. He doesn't use the full extent of his powers if there's another way, and he doesn't even really like them. I'm not saying there's no other MC who's similar to that, just the way Mob Psycho handles a lot of its story and characters, even though similar to other anime and manga, still goes beyond what you might expect and creates something unique. And there's probably no character who's a better example of this than Reigen. I don't know any other character like him. The closest character I can think of right now is another charismatic conman Kaiki, but apart from being charismatic and making money in a similar way, these two have little in common. Reigen is easily one of the strongest aspects of Mob Psycho. Doesn't matter if you're watching the first or the last episode. What I really love is that he is such a huge contrast to all the other characters. He's of course different in that he's basically the only character involved in the psychic world that doesn't have any powers aside from his ability to talk himself out of almost every situation, but he's also different in that he's the only adult among the main cast of characters for most of the time. And even when other older characters are appearing, like Reigen points out, most of them haven't even really seen the world yet. They've just been clinging to their powers all their life without even seeing the world like others that either don't rely on their powers or don't have any have. Reigen also has my favorite character arc. The way he changes over the story is just so well written, and most of my favorite moments heavily involve him. Even though he's often very over the top, and seeing him for the first time you probably wouldn't think it, but when there's a moment where he has to be serious, or when he's giving advice to Mob, you can see that he has that life experience the other characters lack. And I think it's so interesting to have someone like him who's different in so many ways in a story like this. What I also love about him is that he's the most interesting character when looking at how justifiable his actions throughout the story are. are. Of course, he's not doing anything completely horrible, and I would say he's definitely a good person, but when you look at what he does, especially throughout season 1 and 2 and with Mob, it's obvious that he has some huge flaws, and that's what makes him so interesting to me. Like I said earlier, he has life experiences that most of the other characters don't have, and while some of these experiences lead to him giving genuinely good advice to Mob or others, these experiences have also shown him that taking advantage of others may make his life easier, and you don't have to look any further than how he's using Mob throughout a lot of the story. I don't think that anyone thinks that what he's doing in that regard is justified, but that's what makes him so interesting. He has some huge flaws, but aside from that, is a genuinely good guy. And that takes me to what I like the most about Mob Psycho, the different character relationships and dynamics between two characters. I think this is where the anime just goes beyond anything I expected, and also where Mob shines the most. When I first started watching Mob Psycho 100 and then later dropped it, a huge part of why I didn't come back was its main character. I didn't dislike Shigeo, but I just didn't find him interesting enough, and there was nothing about him that grabbed me and motivated me to want to know more about him. But the further you go into the story of Mob Psycho, the more you see the different sides of Mob, and the way the show does this a lot of the time is through Mob's relationships with 4 different characters. There are of course other characters where when Mob interacts with them, you see different sides of his personality and how he evolves. Like when he talks to Tsubomi, or when he spends time with either their telepathy or the body improvement club. And these interactions can reveal a lot about Mob's personality and how he changes throughout the story. He gets more confident when talking to Tsubomi, and since we don't see much of her outside the times she shares a scene with Mob, these moments give her more of a personality and show a side of Mob you don't really see otherwise. The time he spends in the body improvement club shows his will to improve and not rely on his power, and gives you a good idea not only of his physical growth but also his character growth, as he continues to work on himself and doesn't stop even when his body wants to. And I love how you can see how this time in the body improvement club helps his determination to continue fighting for his friends when they need him most. You of course also get more scenes featuring these amazing middle schoolers built like JoJo characters, and that's always a plus. Mob's relationship with the telepathy club is also great, because even though they want his help searching for espers or other supernatural phenomena, well, really only Tomei, they are some of his only non-esper friends, and Mob can spend time with them without worrying about the next supernatural conflict he has to solve with his powers, and just be a mostly normal boy. There are other interesting relationships in Mob Psycho, like Mob's with Mogami, or between other characters that don't involve Shigeo, but therefore I find the most interesting and that I'm going to talk about are Mob's relationships with Ritsu, Hanazawa, Ikubo or Dimple, or whatever you want to call him, and of course Reagan. These 4 characters are all interesting in their own right, and you could probably talk about them alone for quite some time, but I want to focus on each of them regarding their relationship with Mob, starting with his brother Ritsu. Since I want to talk about these relationships in greater detail, there will be minor spoilers for all of these characters, but I'll include a spoiler warning on screen before talking about anything specific further into Season 2 or in Season 3 that could be considered a spoiler. Ritsu is probably the most important person in Mob's life, especially earlier on, before knowing Reigen, and one of the few people around Mob's age who seemingly doesn't treat him all that differently because of his powers, at least from Mob's point of view. To Mob, Ritsu is his intelligent, strong younger brother whom he can rely on and admires greatly, but even though Ritsu loves his older brother, he also is scared of what could happen if Mob gets stressed out and releases his emotions. What I find interesting is that on the surface they appear to have a solid brotherly relationship where each respects and admires the other for their characteristics, but what they don't show, Ritsu more so than Shigeo, is that even though what appears to be true on the surface still is, they also both have multiple things they rather don't talk about in fear of damaging their relationship. They not only admire each other but envy each other's abilities. Mob doesn't want his powers and thinks they do more harm than good, and would rather have Ritsu's charisma and intelligence, and Ritsu doesn't think much of what he's strong at and would rather have powers similar to Mob and still hopes that they will someday awaken in him. And I think a big part of that desire to have power like Mob is due to Ritsu being scared of what could happen if Mob loses control, the same way he did when they were kids. One of the main reasons Ritsu is so nice and supportive of his brother is so that Mob doesn't get upset and loses control again. Of course, he also tries to be nice because he genuinely loves his brother and wants his best, but there's also that part of him that is scared of Shigeo, or more so of the other identity in him, who he feels shows themselves when Mob reaches a certain amount of repressed emotions and releases them. Mob also is scared to use his powers on humans since he lost control and can't remember what he did and fears that he used his powers to hurt their bullies and his own brother. A lot of these issues reach their boiling point when Ritsu grows more frustrated at his lack of psychic abilities and eventually awakens his powers. He begins to act more cold and distant and does some really questionable things. And this all reaches its climax when Ritsu is confronted by multiple school gangs who take him for his brother and want to fight. And this is where episode 8 starts, and like I said before, this episode is just fantastic. You get an amazing fight and the introduction to Claw, but what I think stands out the most in this episode, and why I wanted to talk about Mob's relationship with Ritsu first, is their conversation and what Mob is willing to do for his younger brother. Ritsu confronts Mob and tells him how he felt all the time without powers and how he tried not to stress him, out of fear of what might happen, and throws all of these thoughts he had the past years and what he thinks now that he finally has powers at Shigeo, and Mob just reacts happy that his brother finally has what he wanted all these years, and can tell that Ritsu doesn't really mean all of the negative things he's saying. Mob is just such a good person. He just wants his brother to be happy and understands that Ritsu doesn't have it easy either, and apologizes for what his brother has done. He doesn't want any unnecessary conflicts or fights and is there to help when his brother needs it. This of course continues with the fight right after and with Claw. Their relationship really grows with the end of season 1 and they can finally be a lot more open about any issues they might have, and there are other multiple moments where you see just how much they mean to each other. There's of course the time when Mob thinks his parents and brother were killed and the impact that has on him, and later on when Ritsu confronts Mob and finally accepts that what he gets shown whenever Mob releases his emotions is also part of him and not a different being that has to be feared and sealed away. There's something about the bond and relationship between siblings and parents with their kids that just gets me, especially in anime, and it's oftentimes a huge part of my emotional investment in characters and their stories. One of my favorite anime, Clannad, puts a lot of focus on that sort of relationship, and it's just so wonderful. And even though this isn't one of the main aspects of Mob Psycho 100, I still think it's handled in a really interesting way, and wish more anime or manga would explore the relations between parents and their children, or siblings in interesting ways like Clannad did it, or Mob Psycho, and not in a way like some other anime do. My favorite character besides Shigeo and Reigen is probably Hanazawa, with his glorious hair, and a huge part of why I like him that much is his interactions with Mob. I'd say he's maybe the character that changes the most over the story. There are of course other characters who undergo a lot of changes, Ritsu or Reigen for example, but they're not that different in the end compared to their first appearance. I'd say they grow or evolve more, but when you go from their first appearance in the story straight to the last, what they do doesn't seem that unbelievable compared to someone like Dimple or Suzuki or Hanazawa. While I would say that someone like Dimple or Suzuki undergoes a huge change from start to finish, Hanazawa not only has that one change from a selfish, arrogant antagonist to a supportive friend and sort of rival, at least in his eyes, but he also continues to grow a lot as a person over the following seasons and manages to be an interesting character all the way up to his final and most important appearance, where he gets a whole episode in the final arc basically dedicated to him and his confrontation with Mob, where all of his growth as a character is shown, and I love it. Next to Mob, he's probably the character closest to a protagonist, and what I mean by that is that while he has less screen time than someone like Reigen, you see a lot of his inner thoughts and the way he approaches different problems. When you see other characters' thoughts, they often revolve around Mob, and you see less of their inner thoughts in situations that don't involve Mob, or they're at least presented differently. I don't know if I can put into words what it is that I mean exactly, but when you take a scene focused on another character like Ritsu in episode 7 for example, his scenes feel more like the viewer is watching the character from an outside point of view, even when you get some of his thoughts, and I'm sure a part of that is also because Ritsu in this episode does more and more things that could lead to him eventually becoming a sort of antagonist to Mob, but even before he does anything bad, you even get more insight into Dimple, who's clearly the antagonistic one in these scenes, than into Ritsu. Compared to that, scenes that focus on Hanazawa give you way more insight into his mind and how and why he does something, and he's presented more as the protagonist of these scenes than someone like Ritsu in scenes revolving around him. Now of course it could be that most people don't see it the way I do, but even then I would find it interesting that these scenes are done in a way where they can be interpreted quite differently depending on which person you ask. I already really like Hanazawa on his own, but his interactions with Mob are some of my favorites, and the best example is their final confrontation in contrast to their first. All characters shine in the last arc. Ritsu finally comes to terms with Mob's power and accepts that they are as much a part of him as his friendly and brotherly side. Reigen decides to finally be honest with Mob and tell him who he really is deep down and how much Mob means to him, and even Dimple gets his time to shine, but Hanazawa has my favorite moment when compared to his first appearance. The reversal of their roles in the two fights, where you first follow Mob as he doesn't want to fight a misguided and out of his mind Hanazawa, and then follow Hanazawa as he doesn't want to fight Mob in his state, but still does to try to bring him back to his senses and return to the good old and friendly Mob, fits their characters perfectly I feel like, and shows all of what Hanazawa learned since they met. To be honest, I don't think there's much left for me to say regarding Hanazawa and his relationship with Mob that the show doesn't already perfectly focus on, but I just wanted to say that their interactions far exceeded anything I expected when looking back. Dimple and Reigen's importance in the story, especially regarding Mob, was clear to me from the first episode, but Hanazawa really surprised me, and I didn't expect him to be of such importance to the story just from their first encounter. I also don't really know what I should be talking about with Dimple, because I don't think there's much for me to add to what Mob Psycho already presents, and I fear I would just repeat one-to-one what you already can see, but at the same time, Dimple as a character and where he ends up at is something so wonderfully presented that I just have to say at least a few words. I think the thing that most people will remember him for, besides his little antics with Mob, Reigen, and the rest of the cast, is undoubtedly the end of his arc and what he ends up doing. There are a lot of antagonists in anime, especially Shounen, that change their minds and end up helping their protagonists or other characters, and oftentimes even join the protagonist's group, Hanazawa being a good example. And there are also multiple antagonists changing their mind at the last second and doing something good before they tragically die, and Dimple kinda does both. He's first presented as a villain and then joins Mob and often helps him, but you never really seem to know if he still will use the chance to get the power he so desperately wants when presented with the opportunity. He definitely does better things after his first fight with Mob, but it isn't really clear if he does these things because he genuinely wants to help or just to get the chance to steal Mob or anyone else's power. Of course, his motives become clearer the more you advance the story, and he does some things he definitely wouldn't have to was his goal to just get power back, and not also to help the people he gets to know and care for. But you still don't know if he wouldn't just use the first chance he gets to get new power, either from Mob or any other way. And this is more or less exactly what he ends up doing, using the power from the masses to fuel his own and become what he always wanted to, or at least what he thinks he always wanted to. Now, like I said, I don't think there's much for me to add to his character arc, but I still want to say how much I loved the end to his character arc. And even though he comes back in the final episode, I think season 3 episode 6 is definitely where his story, or at least his development as a character, ends. I honestly don't really know what to think of him coming back in the final episode after what I assume everyone thought was his death in episode 6. On one side, I personally think I would have preferred if he hadn't come back and episode 6 would have served as a final goodbye, because it was just such a good scene with him deciding to protect Mob and ultimately sacrifice himself for everyone's sake, and going against his selfish wishes shown throughout Mob Psycho. But on the other side, I feel like him coming back in the final episode fits perfectly with Mob Psycho, and with the ultimately happy ending the show was going for. If Dimple had died or become something like Cars, then that would have given the ending something bittersweet, and honestly, I think Mob Psycho as a story probably works the best with a simple good ending. I generally prefer endings with at least a few sad or bittersweet moments that don't just end in a way where basically everything turns out to be happy. But this kind of ending I feel like works better in combination with the story of Mob Psycho and especially Shigeo, instead of a sad one, and makes Mob smile in the end so special to me. There are many moments in Mob Psycho I just love, a lot involving Reigen, and I think my favorite moment still is his scene with Mob on the bridge in season 2. It's definitely the scene that got me the most emotional, but it's closely followed by the final few scenes with Reigen and Mob's smile and the end of episode 6 with Dimple's actions. This is also probably my favorite Mob Psycho fight, and there are a lot of really good fights. I've seen some people say the anime wouldn't have needed another 12 episode season, and about half of the episodes would have been enough. But aside from them adapting the rest of the manga, I think these 12 episodes served as a great way to give the spotlight and end to every character. If the episodes leading up to and included in the Divine Tree arc had been fewer, then that could have lessened the effect of Dimple's choice at the end of episode 6 after all this time he worked for that power. Of all these characters, Reigen is probably the character I want to talk about the most, since he's just such an interesting guy, but I already talked about him, and I feel like there's so much you could say that you could easily make a long video dedicated only to him, and there are probably already enough of those, so I just stick to my opinions on him and his relationship with Mob. Reigen and Mob moments are the highlights for me, there are just so many good ones. Each season has at least one moment worthy of being someone's favorite anime moment. My favorites are Mob being grateful and transferring his power over to Reigen, who uses them just in the best way, Reigen's attempt to reach Mob and his conversation with him in the end. By the way, why do fewer and fewer anime play their openings in an important moment, especially in the last episode? I get that these moments don't fit every anime, especially mainly serious shows, but when they work like in Gurren Lagann or JoJo, they can make an already great moment that much better, and Mob Psycho also proves exactly that with its last episode. I just wish more anime would do moments like this again. And my favorite, like I said, is the moment Reagan and Mob share after the press conference following Reagan's fake psychic allegations. This moment made me realize that Mob Psycho will probably become one of my favorite recent anime, and how much I already was emotionally invested in these characters. If I had to give one reason as to why someone should watch Mob Psycho, then it would probably be Reagan and Mob's relationship. It's always interesting when they share a scene, especially when it's a more serious moment. I said before that Reagan gives a lot of advice to Mob, and while he also sometimes says things that give the impression that he just wants to use Mob for its own benefit, there are also a lot of good life advice and genuinely nice things among the stuff he says. And the same way Mob learns from Reagan, Reagan also learns from him. He wouldn't have changed into the man he is at the end of Mob Psycho had it not been for Shigeo, and what he brings to that dynamic. Mob Psycho 100 is one of the easiest anime to recommend to someone, I feel like. It has really good and unique animation combined with some outstanding fights, good music, an interesting cast of characters, and isn't that long with under 40 episodes. So if you somehow have gotten up to this part in the video and haven't already watched it, then I would recommend to give it a try. It's something special among a lot of other anime with a full adaptation, even though we're getting more of these lately, and a really good ending, which is something sadly a lot of other anime series don't get to have. I'm glad, even though I didn't hear that much hype when season 3 was released, compared to so many other anime the last few months, that it's still a show with so many fans and a great adaptation. I wish you a great rest of the day, and bye.